I drew the same pair of lips using both colored pencils and pastel pencils. If you're wondering which medium might be better for you, hopefully this side-by-side comparison will help. So let's get started. Let's start with the colored pencil drawing first. For the materials, I'm using Prismacolor Premier pencils on Strathmore toned gray paper. Prismacolors are really soft and great for blending, and I love using toned paper because it gives a nice mid-tone base to build your highlights and shadows on. I began by slowly building up a few layers using skin tones, and I worked with very light pressure using small circular motions. In the beginning, you should actually still be able to see some of the paper showing through your layers. That's actually a good thing because it means that the paper still has enough tooth to hold more pigment later on. One important tip is to leave your highlights empty from the start. It's much easier to build around the empty space than to try and erase or lighten later, especially with colored pencils. As you can see, I'm leaving on the bottom lip a space where the highlights will be. Once I created a soft, even base, I started pressing slightly harder to deepen the shadows and create even more dimension. I saved the brightest highlights and the tiny realistic details for last, using a really sharp pencil to get crisp lines and textures. One thing I really appreciate about colored pencils is the amount of control you have over small details. You can layer colors so precisely and sharpen the pencils as much as you need to. Another big strength is how durable colored pencil artwork is. Since it doesn't smudge easily once it's finished, it's really great for highly detailed work or pieces that you want to last a long time without needing heavy fixative. But the downside is definitely the time commitment. Because you're layering so slowly and building up the layers bit by bit, a small drawing can take hours to complete. And depending on the brand you use, you might have to deal with wax bloom. That's when a cloudy layer appears on top after a while. It's easy to fix by gently wiping it away, but it's just something to be aware of. Overall though, if you love a slow meditative process where you can really control every mark, colored pencils are an amazing medium to work with. At this stage, I'm really focusing on refining all the subtle transitions, especially like the corners of the mouth and where the lips meet at the center. Those tiny shifts between light and shadow make such a huge difference when you're trying to create a realistic soft look. Even after laying down a few layers, I'm still working with very light pressure. It's tempting to press harder to speed things up, but taking it slow really allows you to build much richer depth and dimension over time. Even when you want darker shadows, it's much better to build them up slowly with multiple layers instead of pressing too hard too soon. If you press too hard too early, the paper can get shiny and smooth, which makes it almost impossible to add more layers later. So even when you're excited to deepen the colors or just finish even faster, it's really worth taking your time. I also sharpen my pencils pretty often, especially for the small, realistic details like the tiny creases in the lips. A sharp pencil makes it easier to get clean lines without digging into the paper. One small challenge with colored pencils is just that it takes a lot of time and patience, especially when you're working on something like skin tones where you want everything to look smooth and even. But with enough layering and blending, the result can be really realistic and detailed. Now moving on to pastel pencils. For this demo, I'm using Stabilo Carbothello pastel pencils on Canson Mouton paper. This paper has a lot more texture compared to the toned gray paper, which helps the pastel pigments stick and blend more easily. I begin by laying down a light base, much like I did with the colored pencils. For the foundation, I chose a mix of reddish pink tones, adjusting them based on the specific lip color I was aiming for. This initial layer helps to establish the overall color and sets the stage for building up depth and dimension. Depending on the undertones that I wanted to highlight, I gradually added layers. When working with pastels, I like to wear a nitrile glove to blend the layers more cleanly, but you can definitely use a clean, dry finger or a pastel blending tool too. On this particular paper though, I find that blending with fingers works really well. As I add each layer of pastel, I blend it softly before adding the next layer. One of the amazing things about pastel pencils is that you can add lighter colors over darker colors pretty easily. So if you lose a highlight, it's much easier to bring it back compared to colored pencil. In a way, pastels feel a little less stressful because you have more flexibility, but at the same time, you have to be careful because they can smudge really easily. I built up the pastel layers in a similar way as colored pencils. First the base, then gradually deepening the shadows, and finally layering in the bright highlights and small details. I always like to establish a strong foundation before getting into those tiny finishing touches. One of the biggest strengths of pastel pencils is how quickly you can cover large areas and blend. But the downside is that the pencils are more delicate, they wear down faster, and they're a lot harder to sharpen into a really fine point. So if you need super fine detail, colored pencils definitely have the advantage there. When using pastel pencils, one of the biggest benefits is how easily they can be layered on top of each other to create beautiful, smooth transitions. This medium works well for anyone who enjoys blending and wants to create more painterly effects. You can build up color quickly, and the blendability is so much more forgiving than with colored pencils, which makes it ideal for softer, more fluid looks. For me, I honestly love both mediums for different reasons. Colored pencils really helped me improve my artistic abilities. They taught me so much about layering, precision, colors, and patience. But when I discovered pastel pencils and pastel sticks, it opened up a whole new world for me creatively. I didn't feel as limited by time or by size anymore because pastels just blend and move a lot faster. Here's a side-by-side look at the final results. With colored pencils, you get sharper details and more control, but it definitely takes longer to layer and blend everything carefully. With pastel pencils, you can create soft blends and richer colors much faster, but they're a little trickier to manage because of smudging and softness. At the end of the day, it really just depends on your style and what you're looking for. I hope this side-by-side demonstration helped you get a better idea of how colored pencils and pastel pencils compare. I'd love to know which one would you want to try. Thanks for watching!